Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation through the book of Genesis. We're accumulating insights and skills along the way that will guide us anytime we feel lost while reading the Bible. So let's recap. Last time we explored Genesis 1 through 11, and we saw how keeping genre and plot in mind can help us navigate even the most challenging passages. Now we're turning the page to Genesis chapters 12 through 50, where the writer zooms in on one family and their many opportunities to choose their way or God's. Now, Genesis 1 through 11 was a creation narrative. Genesis 12 through 50 is a historical narrative. That's a more detailed and concrete genre, closer to the kind of storytelling that we're familiar with today. It was written through people whose culture was very different from our own. So when we get lost here, we need to slow down and try to see how those ancient people would have understood what we're reading. Understanding cultural context will be crucial. It's always helpful to understand the unique way Jewish historical narratives are put together. They're built as a series of interconnected stories. So we're going to look for key words, places, and symbols from one story reappearing in another. That's a clue that the two stories are linked. An ancient Jewish audience would have noticed these connections and understood each story in light of the other. So let's think through a couple of the most troubling passages in all of Scripture and use cultural context and interconnectedness as our guides. Let's begin in Genesis 19, when Lot invites two angelic visitors into his home at the center of Sodom. All the men of the city, young and old, surround the house, demanding to have sex with Lot's guests. Now, Lot does something disturbing here. He offers his own daughters to the mob instead. It's a moment that has shocked readers throughout time and across cultures. It raises important questions. Why would Lot do such a horrible thing? And why is this even in the Bible? Well, let's start with Lot's cultural context. In Lot's world, hospitality was everything. For nomadic herdsmen in the ancient Near East, hospitality required the head of the family to protect his guests at all costs. This was honorable. And this may explain Lot's disturbing behavior. Perhaps it was simply how people defined good for themselves in his culture. Or maybe Lot was acting irrationally, out of desperation. Facing a violent mob, he may have panicked, offering his daughters as a last resort to try to defuse the situation. A third theory is that Lot had become morally compromised by Sodom's culture. Ezekiel 16, verses 49 and 50 tell us that Sodom was destroyed by God because of its arrogance, excess, and disregard for the poor and vulnerable. Hospitality is a good value, but perhaps the values of Lot's culture twisted it. The good practice of hospitality became corrupted, leading Lot to value hospitality even over the lives of the most vulnerable. Now, some scholars point out at this point that living in an ancient patriarchy, Lot may have prized the honor of his male guests and feared the male mob's violence more than he valued the lives of his own daughters. This is disturbing, but it's not uncommon in the ancient world. Now, regardless of which view is correct or if it's a combination, Lot's actions in Genesis 19 show humanity once again defining good for themselves or allowing society around them to define good, and this endangers the most vulnerable. Sometimes, when reading the Bible, the best that we can do is just say, this is awful. I don't understand how anyone could do something like this. Sometimes I believe that's the point. We're supposed to agree with God that this is evil. And to help us do that, the story of Lot and Sodom is intentionally connected to the story of Noah and the flood. Now, in both stories, evil becomes so pronounced and pervasive that God is justified in bringing destruction to prevent it from taking over completely. So let's look at how the writer connects these two stories to one another. First, let's see what the writer places before and after each story. Before the flood story, the sons of God crossed boundaries with the daughters of men, possibly spiritual beings seeking intimacy with humans. After the flood story, Noah's son Ham commits a forbidden act with one of his parents, and alcohol is involved. Now, before the Sodom story, it's a human mob pursuing intimacy with spiritual beings, Lot's angelic guests. And after the Sodom story, Lot's daughters get him drunk and commit incest to preserve the family line. Now, by the way, can you think of other stories in Genesis where people try to keep their family line going through sinful acts? You see, in a Jewish historical narrative, a story may be connected to many other stories. Now, what happens before and after Sodom and the flood is intentional. It's showing us that these two stories are connected somehow. But there's another way the author shows that connection. In Sodom, Lot's family and the angelic visitors stay safe from the mob inside a house at the center of the city. The word house here in Hebrew is the word for ark spelled backward. Both stories are showing evil becoming so pervasive and destructive that God mercifully intervenes to stop its spread. Humanity is locked in a pattern of choosing evil and harming one another, and God steps in repeatedly to rescue us. But evil can't be eradicated completely, not by a flood or by a fire. It persists in the heart of every survivor, and it continues to spread as we decide to go our own way. That's the main point. Now let's navigate another, even more troubling passage and lean on cultural context and interconnectedness. Now imagine that anyone who's ever read Genesis 22 has asked, why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac? Some say Abraham was learning how the living God was different from all the gods he'd ever known. See, in Abraham's culture, people believed they had to bribe the gods to get things like rain, a good harvest, or children. If one sacrifice didn't work, a more costly sacrifice was required. And this escalated until the ultimate sacrifice was made, the life of their own child. So some suggest that God wanted to reveal how Abraham expected gods to behave, and then show him that the living God is not that cruel. The living God does not require child sacrifice before giving us what we need to live. But many scholars believe that while all this may be true, it really misses the main point. They say this story is a do-over. Abraham and Isaac faced the same choice that Adam and Eve faced, but this time there's a very different outcome. The author connects Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 with Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22 by repeating key words, places, and symbols from the first story in the second one. So let's take a look at how that's done. In Genesis 22, the story begins with God telling Abraham to go to Moriah. It's a high place, like Eden. High places and trees in the Bible often mark spots where people meet God and make life-changing choices. So the place from Genesis 3 gets repeated in Genesis 22. Abraham rises early, prepares for the journey, splits the wood, and this word wood is translated as tree in the Eden story. This is the first of several key words from Genesis 3 that get repeated in Genesis 22. Abraham and Isaac travel for 3 days toward Moriah, which means to see. And Abraham sees the mountain in the distance. When they arrive, he takes the wood and the fire, and he takes the knife. This is a strange Hebrew word for knife. It's not the usual word. This word literally means the eater. And all this language, all this shared language is pointing us back to Eden, where Eve saw the tree, took the fruit, and ate. Now in Eden, God said, don't take from the tree. And at Moriah, God tells Abraham to take your son and offer him. In both stories, two people face a test, and it's a choice. It's the same choice. Will they trust God or not? And in each story, humans must trust in God's promise. In Eden, Adam and Eve are promised life and provision and peace if they obey God. For Abraham, God promised that Isaac would live to become a great nation, bringing the blessings of life, provision, and peace to all people. So the author wants us to see these many similarities between the two stories. But he also wants us to see important differences. So unlike Adam and Eve, Abraham trusts that God will keep his promises. So he believes that God will either provide a substitute sacrifice or miraculously raise Isaac from the dead. At the last moment, a voice stops Abraham saying, "Now I know you fear God." Adam and Eve feared God only after their disobedience. Abraham's fear of God is expressed through his trusting obedience. Where Adam and Eve's choice brought death to those meant for life, Abraham's obedience brings life to one prepared to die. So Genesis 22 is like a do-over of Eden. Abraham and Isaac succeed where Adam and Eve failed. And where their rebellion brought death, scarcity, and conflict, Abraham and Isaac's trust in God brings life, provision, and peace. And in the end, God provides a ram to take Isaac's place, connecting this story to yet another one, the story of Jesus. One day, God would provide Jesus as our substitute, providing life and peace to all of us. So today, we've picked up a couple of really useful tools that can help us better understand the most challenging parts of the Bible: interconnected stories and cultural context. First, when we get lost in a cultural narrative, it helps to see if the story we're reading is connected to other stories we know. We can spot these connections by watching for repeated words, places, and symbols. Then we compare how the connected stories are similar and how they're different. And this may help us discern the main ideas we're supposed to grasp. Second, when the Bible's stories shock or confuse us, it's often because they were written through a culture very different from our own. We need to slow down, try to understand these stories as someone from that culture would have. Now, all this takes practice. So keep using these skills as we continue reading through the Bible together. More videos like this one are coming your way soon with more helpful tools that we can use when it feels like something's been lost in translation. See you next time.